they had their homeland. And not only that, but even though it was desolate in the desert, in Ezekiel it said that you will feed the world with fruits and vegetables. You'll be prosperous and fruitful. And you know today, Israel is the second largest exporter of fruit and vegetables to the world. That little teeny dot there, to the world, because it's incredible how things grow. The reason I was putting pennies in jars is Israel has planted over 200 million trees in Israel since 1948. 200 million trees. And it's changed the ecosystem over Israel to places that were dry, arid desert are now fruitful, lush gardens. Isn't that just incredible? But what's so incredible about it is that man can't pull something like this off. Only God can. And God's promised that He would never forget His people. And He would bring them back to this land. So, who was living in this land during those times? All these different empires that brought their people in. Okay? It wasn't until just 600 AD that the Muslims came to the land. Alright? So they are the Arabs. Alright? So for 400 years, the church ruled until World War I, as we talked about. There were none of those other empires. 4,000 years, this was the land promised to Abraham. And then comes World War II. Have you guys learned about the Holocaust yet?
Yeah.
6 million Jews killed in the Holocaust. Okay? So we hear today that Israel was created as a result of the Holocaust, to give a land for the Jews. But remember, it was in 1917 that Winston Churchill was talking about the land for the Jews well before the Holocaust happened. And the truth is that in the late 1800s is when what was called the Zionist movement began. It was actually a Messianic Jew, or it was actually a Jew at the Wailing Wall, was sitting there seeing how the Jews there were being oppressed by the Arabs, and remembered a scripture that he had read 15 years earlier. He whom the sun sets free is free indeed. So when he went back to Russia, he was a Russian Jew, he found a New Testament, and he read it, and he gets saved. So one of the first people, the father or grandfather of the Zionist movement, the movement to bring Jews back in the late 1800s, was actually by someone who put their faith in their Messiah, Jesus. So we see just what a God thing that the Zionist movement was. And then a man by the name of Eliezer ben Yehuda, he gets this burden that there's scripture, you can read the Torah, you can read Hebrew, but Jews were speaking Yiddish or whatever language of whether it be German or Romanian or whatever. So he realized that there's no real Hebrew anymore to say, honey, take out the garbage. You know, there's no conversational Hebrew. So he went back and painstakingly resurrected the Hebrew language with the Hebrew letters and the Hebrew alphabet. And Jews, about 50 years before returning and becoming a nation again, started speaking Hebrew again. Pretty cool coincidence, huh? Did Eliezer have any idea that within 50 years the Jews would be back in Israel and need their language back? No. Did God? Yes. Isn't that so cool? So now you can walk on Ben Yehuda Street in Israel. It's pretty cool. All right. So in 1948, now this was on May 14th at 4:32 in the afternoon, okay, Ben Gruden stood up. They declared Israel a nation again. They sang the Jewish national anthem, which is called Hatikvah. And then the next thing that happened was that that little teeny piece of land was just too much for Israel's enemies to handle, that Israel would have their own land. So all those nations we talked about, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, and Egypt, all attacked Israel in 1948 to try to immediately wipe them out. Now this is real key. This particular war is real key, because this is what the Jews said. They said that any Arab, and now remember that's what they were. They didn't call themselves Palestinians. The land was called Palestine because a Roman emperor named, not Herodian, but not Herod, but Hadrian. Hadrian hated Israel so much that he kicked every Jew out of Israel and then called it Philistia, meaning the land of the Philistines, as a slur, and therefore it got the name Palestine. But nobody called themselves Palestinian. These guys called themselves Jordanians. These guys were Lebanese. These guys were, that's who they were. They just lived in this land that they never claimed to be their land. Jordan had Jerusalem. They never wanted Jerusalem. Nobody ever asked for Jerusalem. It was just Jerusalem, right? But all these countries attacked Israel in 1948, and Israel said this: any Arab living within our new borders, you are welcome to stay here. You can just stay. We're not kicking you out. Any Arab that wants to leave is welcome to leave. So about 1 million Arabs stayed in Israel. Do you know what the descendants of those 1 million Arabs are today? Maybe slaves, right? They are full citizens with more rights than any Arab in any country in the world. They actually prefer to live in the Israeli areas that are governed by Israel because the women have more rights, the men have more rights, they have better jobs, they have better living conditions. They stayed. They not only have the ability to stay and own businesses and work, they actually have their own representation in the Knesset, which is the Israeli government. So the Arabs, the enemies of Israel, are given a seat at the table. Isn't that amazing? You don't hear that on CNN. They actually have their own delegation in the Knesset in Israel. Okay? Then there were about 850,000 that left. And the reason they left is their leader said, get out, we are going to drive these pigs into the sea. Does that sound familiar? Oh yeah, Ahmadinejad is saying we are going to drive these pigs into the sea. Well, take a lesson from history, Ahmadinejad. Let's look at what happened. Instead of driving the pigs into the sea, this little country, this brand spanking new little country, wins. Wins against not just an assault from Egypt and then Jordan and then Iraq and then Syria and then Lebanon, but all of them at the same time, and they win. Now, 1 in about every 100 new Israelis were killed in that war. Can you imagine that? Think of your neighborhood. 1 in every 100. How many kids are in the school here?
100, 120.
Okay, so for as many kids that are around here, 1 in every one of that amount were killed. Pretty devastating. But they went on, and they built cities, and so on and so forth. And then a very important event happened in 1967. In 67, they got a little tired again of Israel having this, and so they thought they would attack again. They would try to wipe the pigs into the sea again in 1967. And so all the same countries, except I don't believe Iraq was part of it at the time, all those countries attacked Israel again. Only this time, in 1967, on June 14th, the Israeli army went and took Jerusalem. They got Jerusalem. There's a neat story that they tell in this thing called the Chain of Generations at the Wall. And it's a true story about a father and his 3 sons in Auschwitz, the concentration camp that killed 3 million Jews in Poland. And one day the father just walked outside and looked toward Jerusalem, looked toward the east, and began to sing and dance. And his sons came running out to him because he would be killed for doing such a thing, and tried to stop him. And he said, I don't care. My eyes are fixed on Jerusalem. Did you know that prior to 1948, when a Jew built his house, he built a room in his house that was unfinished? It was an unfinished room. It was to symbolize that this is never really my home. My home is always Jerusalem. Think about the love that God kept in the hearts of the Jews for thousands of years when they didn't have their homeland. That they would build houses dedicating a room that one day I'll go back. My house isn't finished until I do. And so the sons, they began to rejoice and dance with their father. Well, the father died. 2 of the other brothers died, but 1 brother lived and made it out of Auschwitz. He made it to Jerusalem in 1948, and then he had a son who he passed this story on to his son. His son was a soldier in 1967, but he'd been wounded. And so as he's lying in his hospital bed, hearing that the troops are taking the walls of Jerusalem, they're entering into Jerusalem to take it back, he got out of his bed, wounded, to join his platoon and be one of the soldiers to take back Jerusalem because of that story. It's just an incredible story. So the Jews now, they didn't go after Jerusalem. They didn't demand Jerusalem as more land, even though it was theirs. It has always been theirs. But when they were attacked, God gave it back to them. Well then, in 1967, a new word appeared on our scene. It was called Palestinian. You think the Palestinians have always been here. The Jews and the Palestinians have always fought. That's what CNN makes it sound like. But no, until 1967, when most of your parents were alive, that's when they became Palestinians. Because when the Jews got it, that's